For 25 centuries, one question sat unanswered at the edge of European history. Where did the Etruscans actually come from? The history books gave us an answer. The genetics just proved it wrong. In the hill country of central Italy, in what is now Tuscany, Lazio, and Umbria, a civilization rose in the 9th century BCE that looked like nothing else around it. The Etruscans built cities with advanced drainage systems centuries before Rome had them. They were master metallurgists, turning the iron-rich earth of Elba into weapons and tools that armed much of the ancient Mediterranean. They painted tombs with scenes of banquets, dancing, and the afterlife that still feels startlingly alive today. And they spoke a language that fit nowhere. Every major language in ancient Italy, Latin, Oscan, Umbrian, belonged to the Indo-European family, the same broad linguistic tree that gave us Greek, Sanskrit, and nearly every European tongue spoken today. Etruscan did not. It was and remains one of history's great linguistic orphans, related to almost nothing else we know. This mystery had an ancient explanation. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, told a specific story. The Etruscans, he claimed, descended from Lydians, a people from western Anatolia in what is now Turkey. Facing famine, the Lydians supposedly split their population in two. Half stayed home, half sailed west under a prince named Tyrrhenus, eventually settling in Italy and becoming the Etruscans. For 2,000 years, this was the default explanation for why a people in the middle of Italy spoke a language and carried customs that felt foreign to their neighbors. There was always a competing view. The Roman-era historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus argued the opposite, that the Etruscans were native to Italy, evolving locally out of the earlier Villanovan culture, with no eastern migration at all. For centuries, this was a war fought entirely with old texts, pottery styles, and educated guesswork. Nobody had a way to settle it. Modern archaeology found itself circling the same debate without resolving it. Etruscan tomb goods showed clear contact with the Eastern Mediterranean. Imported goods, artistic motifs, even alphabet forms that hinted at contact with Greek-speaking traders. To some scholars, this looked like confirmation of Herodotus. To others, it looked like ordinary trade, no different from any coastal civilization, absorbing outside influence without absorbing outside people. Early genetic studies in the 2000s only deepened the confusion instead of resolving it. Researchers looking at mitochondrial DNA from modern Tuscan populations found some genetic signals connecting them to populations in modern Anatolia. Headlines ran with it. The Lydian migration theory seemed, for a moment, vindicated by science. But there was a problem, and it was a serious one. Those studies were working with modern DNA from modern people thousands of years removed from the Etruscans themselves. 2.5 millennia is enough time for population movements, trade, conquest, and simple genetic drift to scramble any signal beyond reliable interpretation. Modern Tuscan DNA can tell you about modern Tuscans. It cannot, on its own, tell you who built the tombs at Tarquinia in 700 BCE. The debate needed something modern genetics alone could not supply: DNA from the Etruscans themselves. That changed in 2021. A team led by Cosimo Post, working with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and collaborators across Europe, published a study in the journal Science Advances that did something no one had done before. They sequenced genome-wide data from 82 individuals who actually lived in Etruria and southern Italy, spanning an almost 2,000-year window from 800 BCE to 1000 CE. This was not modern DNA used to guess at an ancient population. This was a direct genomic time transect, built from skeletal remains recovered across 12 archaeological sites. For the first time, researchers could ask the Etruscans themselves where they came from, instead of asking their descendants 2,500 years later. The method matters here, and it is worth pausing on. Ancient DNA analysis works by extracting genetic material preserved in bone, most reliably from the dense petrous portion of the skull, then comparing genome-wide patterns against reference populations from across Europe, Anatolia, and the steppe. It cannot tell you what language someone spoke, or what god they prayed to. It can tell you, with real statistical confidence, which populations contributed to someone's ancestry, and when. This is a crucial distinction, and one documentary science often glosses over. A genome is not a passport. It does not record ethnicity, nationality, or self-identity, because none of those categories existed in the way we use them today, and even if they had, DNA does not encode them. What a genome does record is a mixture of ancestral components, inherited in measurable proportions from populations that lived generations, sometimes thousands of years, earlier. Reading that mixture requires comparing it statistically against large panels of other ancient and modern genomes, a process that produces probabilities and confidence intervals, not verdicts. Reputable ancient DNA research is careful about this distinction, even when the headlines that follow it are not. The results were unambiguous, and they surprised almost no one who had been paying close attention to the archaeology, while overturning what 2,000 years of popular storytelling had assumed. The Etruscans were genetically local. During the Iron Age, their ancestry closely matched other Italic-speaking populations living right next door, including the early Latin-speaking communities around Rome. The researchers found an Indo-European associated steppe ancestry component in the Etruscan genomes, the same deep signal found across most of Iron Age Europe from the Bronze Age migrations centuries earlier. What they did not find was any distinct recent genetic contribution from Anatolia that would support a Lydian migration in the way Herodotus described it. In plain terms, the people who built Etruscan civilization were not recent arrivals from Turkey. They were drawn from the same deep ancestral layers as their Latin-speaking neighbors, a blend of Bronze Age steppe herders, Neolithic farmers who had arrived from Anatolia thousands of years earlier during a much older migration wave, and the old hunter-gatherer populations of Europe. The same genetic recipe as Rome, a different language entirely. This is the detail that makes the findings so striking. Two neighboring peoples, genetically almost indistinguishable from each other, and yet one spoke Latin and the other spoke a language linguists still cannot fully classify. Ancestry and language had quietly split apart, and nobody had been able to prove it until the bones themselves were asked directly. So, where does that leave the language? This is where the study is honest about its limits, and that honesty matters. Genetics can tell you about biological ancestry. It cannot, by itself, explain how a language survives or where it originated. The Etruscan language may be a genuine linguistic relic, a survivor from a much older layer of European speech that predates the Indo-European expansion entirely, holding on in this one region while its neighbors adopted Indo-European tongues. Some researchers point to distant relationships with other so-called Tyrcenian languages, including one once spoken on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean, suggesting these languages may have spread outward from Italy rather than into it. What the genome data forces us to abandon is the tidy version of the story, the one where a foreign people sailed in and became the Etruscans wholesale. Language and ancestry, it turns out, do not have to travel together. A population can remain rooted in place for thousands of years while its speech follows a path no migration map can fully explain. That decoupling, more than any single ancestry percentage, is the discovery that rewrites the textbook entry. The same study did not stop with the Etruscans. It followed the genetic signal of central Italy forward across 2,000 years, and what it found next was arguably even more dramatic than the Iron Age result. During the Roman imperial period, The genetic profile of the region shifted abruptly and substantially, with researchers documenting a population-wide shift toward roughly 50% ancestry connected to the Eastern Mediterranean. This lines up precisely with what history already tells us about Rome, an empire that moved people, by trade, by conquest, and by slavery, across its entire Mediterranean world at a scale without precedent in the ancient world. The empire did not just move goods and ideas. It physically reshaped the ancestry of the Italian peninsula within a matter of centuries, an effect larger and faster than the supposed Etruscan migration that never actually happened. Then, during the early Middle Ages, the researchers detected a further shift, with Northern European genetic components appearing in central Italy, consistent with the population movements that followed the fall of Rome and the arrival of groups like the Lombards. Cosimo Post, the study's lead author, framed the Roman-era shift in terms that go beyond central Italy alone. He described the empire as leaving a long-lasting genetic contribution across southern Europe, one that effectively bridged European and Eastern Mediterranean populations on the broader genetic map of Western Eurasia. That is a striking claim on its own. The single largest genetic transformation this 2,000-year transect captured was not the mysterious Etruscans at all. It was Rome itself, quietly reshaping the ancestry of the peninsula it ruled, largely unremarked upon in the popular imagination because it did not come wrapped in the same ancient mystery as a lost Eastern migration. Put together, the 2,000-year transect tells a story that is stranger and more interesting than any single migration legend. Central Italy was not a fixed population that received one dramatic influx from the east in 700 BCE. It was a region that stayed remarkably stable through the Etruscan and early Roman periods, then absorbed a massive wave of Eastern Mediterranean ancestry under empire, then absorbed a wave of Northern European ancestry as that empire collapsed. The Etruscans themselves sit at the calm point in that story, genetically continuous with their Iron Age neighbors, culturally and linguistically distinct in ways science still cannot fully explain, and mistaken for millennia as recent immigrants because their language sounded foreign to people who assumed foreign language had to mean foreign blood. That assumption, so old it was never really questioned, turned out to be the whole error. The Etruscan case is a warning against a very human instinct, reading a strange language, a strange custom, or a strange religious practice as proof of strange, distant origins. For 2,500 years, a people's identity was defined by an outsider's guess about where they must have come from, because their culture did not fit the assumptions of the people writing the history. Ancient genomics does not always overturn the past with a shocking secret. Sometimes what it overturns is a story that felt so intuitive, so narratively satisfying, that no one thought to check it against the evidence sitting quietly in the bones themselves. The Etruscans were not exiles from a foreign shore. They were the people who had always been there, speaking a language that owed nothing to migration and everything to a depth of time we are still learning to read. History is not only written in stone inscriptions and old historians' accounts. It is written in the genome, layer upon layer, waiting for the right question to unlock it. The Etruscans never left. We simply hadn't asked their bones the right question yet.